Storytime. Oh, that's a little loud. Tim. Okay, there we go. Um, so as I mentioned last stream, I got a loan for a computer that just came through today. So I ordered a new computer, and it should be coming in next week. I had been expected to finish the Secret Garden today, but I was looking, we still have about 120 pages left, so I'm probably going to finish it next week. Still on this computer or on my new computer, hopefully on my new computer. And sometime today I may be getting my new webcam, so if I step away from the stream. Anyways, let's go ahead and get started because we've got a lot to do. It's Jean. The Munnet waste no time. Of course, Mary did not wake in the morning. She slept late because she was tired, and when Martha brought her breakfast, she told her that though quite quiet, he was ill and feverish, as he always was after he fell out with a fit of crying. Mary ate her breakfast slowly as she listened. He says he wishes thou would please go and see him as soon as thou can, Martha said. What a fancy he took to thee. That did give him last night for sure, didn't thou? Nobody else would have dared to do it. Poor lad, he's been spoiled till salt won't. My mother says, as the two worst things as can happen to a child is never to have or always to have it. He doesn't know which is the worst. That was in a self too. But he says to me when I went into his room, please ask Miss Mary if she'll talk to me. Think of him saying, please. Will you go, miss? I'll first, said Mary. No, I'll go and see Colin first and tell him with a sudden inspiration. She had her hat on when she appeared in Colin's room. For a second he looked disappointed. He was in bed. His face was pitifully white, circles round his eyes. I'm glad you came, he said. My head aches and I ache because I'm so tired. Are you going somewhere? Mary went and leaned against. I won't be long, she said. I'm going to Dickon, but I'll come back. Colin is about the garden. His whole face brightened and a little color came back into it. Oh, is it? He cried out. I dreamed about it all night. I heard you say something about green, and I dreamed I was standing in a place all filled with trembling little green leaves, and there were birds on nests everywhere, and they looked so soft and still. I'll lie and think come back. In 5 minutes, Mary was with Dickon in her garden. The crow were with him again, and this time he had brought 2 tame squirrels. I came over on the pony this morning, he said. He is a good little chap. He's a good little champ, Chub is. I brought these 2 in my pocket. One is called Nut, and this other one is called Shell. When he said Nut, one squirrel right shoulder, and when he said Shell, the other one leaped onto his left shoulder. When they sat with Captain curled at their feet, Soot solemnly listened on a tree, and nosing about close to them, it seemed to Mary that it would be scarcely bearable to leave such. But when she began to tell her story, somehow the look in Dickon's funny face gradually changed. She could see he felt sorrier for Colin than she did. He looked up at the sky and just listened to them birds. The world seems full of 'em, all whistling, he said. Look at 'em darting about, and hearken to 'em calling to each other. Seems as if all the world's calling. The leaves is uncurling so you can. And my word, the nice smells there is about. Sniffling with his nose. And that poor lad lying shut up and seeing so little that he gets things that sets him screaming. We mun get him out. We mun get him watching and listening and sniffing up the air, and get him just so sunshine, and we must lose no time about it. When he was very much interested, he often spoke quite broad Yorkshire, though at other times he tried to modify his dialect so that Mary could better understand. But she loved his broad Yorkshire, and hadn't to learn to speak it herself, so she spoke a little now. Ay, that we mun, she said. Yes, indeed we must. I'll tell thee what I'll do first, she proceeded, and because when the little wench tried to twist her tongue into speaking Yorkshire, it amused him very much. He's too gradedly fancy to thee. He wants to see thee and see Soot and Captain. When I go back to the house to talk to him, talk to him. I'll ask Kana come and see him tomorrow morning, and bring their creatures with thee. And then, when there's more leaves out and happen a bud or two, we'll get him to come, and thou shalt put him in his pull him. Oh gosh, and thou shalt bear, and we'll bring him here and show him everything. When she stopped, she was quite. She had never made a long speak in Yorkshire before, and she had remembered very well. "Some Yorkshire like that to Master Colin," Dickon chuckled. "Thou make him laugh, and that's as little folk as laughing is. Mother says as mother's as half hour goods laugh one every morning. The cur Mother says she believes as half an hour's good laugh would cure a chap as was making ready for typhus fever." "I'm going to talk this very day," said Mary, chuckling herself. The garden had reached the wind every day and every night. It seemed as if magicians were passing through and drawing loveliness out of the earth and the boughs with wands. It was hard to go, particularly as Nut had actually crept onto her dress, and Shell had scampered down the trunk of the apple they sat under, and stayed there looking at her with inquiring eyes. But she went back to the house, and when she was close to Colin's bed, he began to sniff as Dickon did when, though not as much an experienced way. "You smell like flowers and fresh things," quite joyously. "What is it you smell of? It's cool and warm and sweet all in the same time." "It's the wind from the moor," said Mary. "It comes a sitting on the grass under a tree with Dickon and Soot and Nut and Shell, and the springtime and the outdoors, and the doors shine, and it smells so greedily." She said it as broadly as she could. You do not know how broadly Yorkshire sounds until you have heard someone speak it. Colin, "What are you doing?" he said. "I've never heard you talk like that before. How fun!" "I'm giving thee a bit of Yorkshire," answered Mary triumphantly. "I canna speak as speedily as Dickon or Martha can, but thou sees I can shape a bit. Stand a bit of Yorkshire when thou hears it. And tha Yorkshire lad, thyself bred and born. I wonder thou art not ashamed of thy face." And then she began to laugh too, and they both laughed until they could not stop themselves, and they laughed until the load and Mrs. Medlock opened the door to come in, and drew back into the corridor, and stood amazed. "Well, upon my word," she said, speaking rather broad Yorkshire herself, because there was no one to hear her, and she was so astonished. "Who ever heard the like? Ever on earth would have thought of who would have thought it?" Much to talk about. It seemed as if Colin would never hear enough of Dickon and Captain and Soot and Bell and the pony whose name was Jump. Mary had run round into the wood with Dickon to see Jump, a tiny little shaggy moor pony with thick locks hanging over his eyes and with a pretty face and velvet nose. He was rather thin with living on the moor grass, but he was as tough and wiry as if his little legs had been made of steel springs. He had lifted his head and whinnied the moment he saw Dickon, and he had trotted up to him and put his head across his shoulder, and had talked into his ear, and Jump had talked back in odd little whinnies and puffs and snorts, and had made him give Mary his small front hoof and kiss her on her cheek with his velvet. "Does he really understand everything Dickon says?" Colin said. "It seems as if he does, Andy. Dickon says anything will understand if you're friends with it for sure, but you have to be sure." Colin lay quiet a little while, and his strange grey eyes seemed to be still. Mary saw he was thinking. "I wish I was friends with things," he said at last. "But I never had anything to be friends with, and I can't bear people." "Can't you bear me?" asked Mary. "Yes, I can," he answered. "It's funny, but I even like you." "Ben Weatherstaff him," said Mary. "He said he'd warrant we both got the same nasty tempers. I think you were like we are all three alike, you and I and Ben Weatherstaff. He said we are not to look at, and we were as sour as we looked. But I don't feel as sour as I used to with Robin and Dickon." "Do you feel as if you hated people?" "Yes," answered Mary with affectation. "I should have detested you if I had seen you with Robin and Dickon." Colin put out his thin hand and touched her. "Mary, I wish I hadn't said what I did about sending Dickon away. I hated you when you said he was. I laughed at you, but perhaps he is." "Well, it was rather funny," she admitted frankly. because his nose does turn up and he has a big mouth and his clothes have them and he talks broad Yorkshire, but if an angel did come to Yorkshire and live on the moor, and if there was a Yorkshire angel, I believe he'd understand the green things and know how to make them grow. Know how to talk to the wild creatures as Dickon does, and they'd know he was friends for sure. I'm Dickon looking at me, said Colin. I want to see him. I'm glad you said that, Aunt, because quite suddenly it came into her mind that this was the minute to tell Colin knew something new was coming. Because what? He cried eagerly. Mary anxious that she got up from her stool and came to him and caught hold of both of his hands. I trusted Dickon because birds trusted him. Can I trust you for sure? For sure! Her face was so solemn that he almost whispered his answer. Yes. Yes. Well, Dickon will come to see you tomorrow morning, and he'll bring his creatures with him. Oh! Colin cried out in delight. But that's not all, Mary went on, almost pale with sorrow. The rest is better. There is a door into the garden. I found it. It is under the oak. If he had been a strong, healthy boy, Colin probably would have shouted, Hooray! But he was hysterical. His eyes grew bigger and bigger, and he gasped for breath. Oh, Mary, with a half sob, shall I see it? Shall I get into it? Shall I live to get into it? And he dragged her toward him. Of course you'll see it, snapped Mary indignantly. Get into it. Don't be silly. And she was so unhysterical and natural and childish, he came to his senses, and he began to laugh at himself. And a few minutes afterward, she was sitting on her stool, and not what she imagined the secret garden to be like, but what it really was. And aches and tiredness were forgotten, and he was listening enraptured. You thought it would be, he said at last. It sounds just as if you had really seen it, when you told me first. Mary hesitated about 2 minutes and boldly spoke the truth. I had seen it, and I had been in, she said. I found the key and got in weeks ago, but I daren't tell you. I daren't because I was so afraid I couldn't trust sure. Chapter 19. It Has Come. Of course, Dr. Craven had been sent for the morning after Colin had had his tantrum. He was always sent for if such a thing occurred, and he always found, when he arrived, a white shaken boy lying and looking, and still so hysterical that he was ready to break into fresh sobbing at the last word. In fact, Dr. Cravens dreaded and detested the difficulties of these visits. On occasion, he was away from Misselthwaite Manor until afternoon. How is he? He asked rather irritably when he arrived. He will break a blood vessel on one of those fists some day. The boy is half insane with hysteria and self-indulgence. Well, sir, answered, you'll scarcely believe your eyes when you see him. That plain, sour-faced child, almost as bad as himself, has just bewitched him. How she's done it, there's no telling. She's nothing to look at, and you scarcely ever hear her speak. She did what none of us dared. Just flew at him like a little cat last night and stamped her feet and ordered him to stop. Somehow she startled him so that he actually did stop. And this afternoon, look up and see, sir, it's past crediting. The scene which Dr. Craven beheld entered his patient's room was indeed rather astonishing to him. As Mrs. Medlock heard laughing and chattering, Colin was on his sofa in his dressing gown, and he was straight looking at a picture in one of the garden books, and talking to the plain child who at that moment could scarcely be called plain at all, because her face was so glowing with enjoyment. Those long spires of blue ones? We'll have a lot of those, Colin was announcing. They're called diams. Dickens says there's larkspur made big and grand, cried Mr. There are clumps there already. Then they saw Dr. Craven and stopped. Mary began. Colin looked fretful. I am sorry to hear you were ill last night, my boy, said a trifle nervously. He was rather a nervous man. I'm better now, much better, Colin answered rather like a Rajah. I'm going out in my chair in a day or two if it is. I want some fresh air. Dr. Craven sat down by him and felt his pulse curiously. It must be a very fine day, he said, and you must be very tired yourself. Fresh air won't tire me, said the young Rajah. An occasion when this same young gentleman had shrieked aloud with rage and had insisted that from cold and kill him, it was not to be wondered at that his doctor startled. I thought you did not like fresh air, he said. I don't when I am, replied the Rajah, but my cousin is going with me. And the nurse, of course, said Dr. Craven. No, I will not have the nurse. So magnificently that Mary could not bring how the young native prince had looked with his diamonds and emeralds and pearls stuck all over him, great rubies on the small dark hand he had waved to command his servants to approach with salaam to receive his orders. My cousin knows how to take care of me. I am always better when she made me better last night. A very strong boy I know will push my carriage. Craven felt rather alarmed. If this tiresome, hysterical boy should chance to, he himself would lose all chance of inheriting Misselthwaite. But he was not an unman, though he was a weak one, and he did not intend to let him run into actual danger. He must be a strong boy and a steady boy, he said, and I must know something about him. Who is he? It's Dickon. Mary spoke up suddenly. She felt somehow that everybody must know Dickon, and she was right, too. She saw that in a moment Dr. Craven's serious into a relieved smile. Oh, Dickon, he said. If it's Dickon, you will be safe enough. He's more pony as Dickon. And he's trusty, said Mary. He's the trustiest lodger. She had been talking Yorkshire to Colin, and she forgot herself. Did Dickon teach Dr. Craven, laughing outright? I'm learning it as if it was French, said Mary. It's like a native dialect in India. Very clever people try to learn them. I like it, Colin. Well, well, he said, if it amuses you, perhaps it won't do any harm. Bromide last night, Colin. No, Colin answered. I wouldn't take it at first, and quiet she talked me to sleep, in a low voice, about the spring creeping into a garden. Soothing, said Dr. Craven, more perplexed than ever, and glancing sideways at Mistress Mary, sitting on her and looking down silently at the carpet. You are evidently better, but you must want to remember, interrupted the Rajah, appearing again. Lie by myself and remember I begin to have pains everywhere, and I think of things that make me begin to scream because I hate them so. If there was a doctor anywhere who you forget you were ill instead of remembering it, I would have brought him here. And he waved with ought really to have been covered with royals made of rubies. It is because my cousin makes me forget that she makes me better. Craven had never made such a short stay after tantrum. Usually he remained a very long time and do a great many things. This afternoon he did not leave any new orders, and he was spared any disagreeable scenes. When he went downstairs thoughtful, and when he talked to Mrs. Medlock in the library, she felt that he was a much puzzled man. Sir, she ventured, could you have believed it? It is certainly a new state of affairs, and there is no denying it is better than the old one. I believe Susan South would do that, said Mrs. Medlock. I stopped in her cottage on my way to Thwaite yesterday and had a with her, and she says to me, well, Sarah Ann, she mayn't be a good child, and she may one, but she's a child, and children need children. We went to school together, Susie and me. She's the best sick nurse I know, said Dr. Craven. When I find her, I know the chances are that I shall save my patient. Mrs. Medlock smiled fond of Susan Sowerby. She's got a way with her, has Susan, she went on quite volubly. I've been thinking all morning of one thing she said yesterday. She said, once giving the children a bit of a preach after they'd been fighting, I says to 'em all, well, I was Jeopardy told, and the world was shaped like an orange, and I found out beforehand that the whole orange doesn't belong to nobody. No one owns more than a quarter, and there's times it seems like there's not enough quarter. But don't you, none of you, think as you own the whole orange, or you'll be mistaken. You won't find it out without hard knocks. What children learns from children is that there's no sense in grabbing at the whole orange, peeling off. You do, you're likely not even get the pits, and them's too bitter to eat. She's a shrewd woman, said Dr. Craven, putting on his coat. Well, she's got a way of saying things, and did Mrs. much pleased. Sometimes I've said to her, Susan, you are a different woman, and talks such broad Yorkshire. I'd seen the times when I should have said you was clever. That night Colin slept without one awakening, and when he opened morning, he lay still and smiled without knowing it. Smiled because he felt so curious. It was actually nice to be awake, and he turned over and stretched his limbs luxuriously. Tight strings which had held him had loosened themselves and let him go. He did not know, the doctor said, that his nerves had relaxed and rested themselves. Instead of lying and staring at the wall he had not awakened, his mind was full of the plans he and Mary had made yesterday, of pictures of the and of Dickon and his wild creatures. It was so nice to have things to think about. And he had more than 10 minutes when he heard feet running along the corridor, and Mary was at the door. The next minute she was in the room and had run across to his bed, bringing with her a waft of fresh air into the morning. "You've been out! You've been out! There's that nice smell of leaves." She had been running, and her hair was loose and blown, and she was bright with the air and pink. She could not see it. "It's so beautiful," she said, a little breathless with her speed. "You never saw anything so beautiful. It has come. I thought it had come, but it was only coming. It is here now. It has come, the spring. Dickon says so," said Colin, and though he really knew nothing about it, he felt his heart beat. He actually said, "Open the window," he added, laughing half with joyful excitement and half fancy. "Perhaps we may hear golden trumpets." And though he was at the window in a moment, and in a moment more, it was opened wide, and freshness and scents and birds soaring through. "That's fresh air," she said, lying your back and drawing a long breath. "That's what Dickon does when he is lying on the moor. He says that he feels it in his veins, and it makes him, and he feels as if he could live forever and ever. Breathe it and breathe it." Repeating what Dickon had told her, but she caught Colin's fancy. "Forever and ever. Does it feel like that?" he said, and he did as she told him, drawing deep breaths over and over and again until he felt that something quite new was happening to him. Mary was at his bedside again. "Things are crowded the earth," she ran on in a hurry, "and there are flowers uncurling and buds on everything. It's covered nearly all the gray, and the birds are in such a hurry about their nests for fear they might be, that some of them are even fighting for places in the secret garden. And the rose bushes look as wick as we, and there are primroses in the lanes and woods, and the seeds we planted are up, and Dicks and the crow and the squirrels, and a newborn lamb." And then she paused for breath. The lamb Dickon had found 3 days before, lying by its dead mother among the gorse bushes on the moor. It was not the first motherless lamb he had found, and he knew what to do with it. He had taken it to the cottage, and he had let it lie near the fire, and had fed it with warm milk. It was a soft thing, silly baby face, and legs rather long for its body. Dickon had carried it in his arms, and its feeding bottle in his pocket with a squirrel, and when Mary had seen it with its limp warmness huddled on her lap, she had felt as if she were too full of strange. A lamb, a living lamb who lay on her lap like a baby. She was describing it with such joy, and Colin was listening and drawing in longer when the nurse entered. She started a little at the sight of the open window. She had been in the room many a warm day because her patient was sure that open windows gave you. "Are you sure you are not chilly, Master Colin?" she inquired. Was the answer. "I am breathing long breaths of fresh air. It makes you strong. I am going to the sofa for breakfast. My cousin will have breakfast with me." The nurse went away, concealing the order for 2 breakfasts. She found the servants' hall a more amusing place than the inn, and was just now everybody wanted to hear the news from upstairs. There was joking about the unpopular young recluse who, as the cook said, had found his master. The servants' hall had been very tired of the tantrums, and the butler, who was a man had more than once expressed his opinion that the invalid all the better for a good hiding. When Colin was on his sofa and the breakfast for two put on the table, he made an announcement to the nurse in his most Rajah-like manner. "A boy, a fox, a crow, and 2 squirrels, and a newborn lamb are coming to see me this. I want them brought upstairs as soon as they come," he said. "You are not to begin playing with the servants' hall and keep them there. I want them here." The nurse gave a slight gasp and tried to cough. "Yes, sir," she answered. "I'll tell you what you can do," added Colin, waving his hand. "Tell Martha to bring them here. The boy is Martha's brother. His name is Dickon, and he is an animal charmer." I hope the animals won't bite, Master Colin, said the nurse. I told you he was a charmer, Colin, austerely. Charmers animals never. Oh, thank you, Swedish Menace. This was one of favorites that I made. Just some broker, and this stuff right here was really delicate. I had to put a little bit of on it to keep it from fraying. Uh, yeah. Anyways, get back to. There are snake charmers in India, said Mary, and they can put their snakes' heads. Goodness, shuddered the nurse. They ate their breakfast with the morning air pouring in upon them. Breakfast was a very good one, and Mary watched him with serious interest. You will begin to get fatted, she said. I never wanted my breakfast when I was in India, and now I always want it. I was wondering, said Colin. Perhaps it was the fresh air. When do you think Dickon will come? He was coming. In about 10 minutes, Mary held up her hand. Listen, she said. Do you hear a caw? Listened and heard it. The oddest sound in the world to hear inside a house. A hoarse caw. Yes, he answered. That's Soot, said Mary. Listen again. Do you hear a bleat? Oh, yes, cried Colin, quite flushing. That's the newborn lamb, said Mary. Dickon's moorland boots were thick and clumsy, and though he tried to walk quietly, a thumping sound as he walked through the long corridors. Mary and Colin heard him march through the tapestry door on the soft carpet of Colin's own passage. If, announced Martha, opening the door, if you please, sir, here's Dickon and his creatures. Dickon gave his nicest wide smile. His newborn lamb was in his arms, and the little red fox trotted by his side. Nut sat on his left, Shut on his right, and Shell's head and paws peeped out of his coat pocket. Colin slowly sat up and stared as he had stared when they married. But this was a stare of wonder and delight. The truth was that in spite he had heard, he had not in the least understood that what this boy would be like, and that his father and his squirrels and his lamb were so near to him in his friendliness that they seemed almost to be part. Colin had never talked to a boy in his life, and he was so overwhelmed by his own pleasantry that he did not even think of speaking. But Dickon did not feel shy or awkward. He had not felt embarrassed because the crow had not known his language, stared, and had not spoken to him the first time they met. Creatures were always like that until they knew. He walked over to Colin's sofa and put the newborn lamb quietly on his lap, and immediately the little creature turned to the warm velvet dressing gown and began to nuzzle into its folds and butt its tight curled head with soft impatience against his side. Of course, no boy could have helped speaking then. What is it doing? Cried Colin. What does it want? Sir, said Dickon, smiling more and more. I brought it to thee a bit hungry because I knowed that it feed. He knelt down by the sofa and took a feeding bottle from his pocket. Colin, he said, turning a small woolly white head with a gentle brown hand, this is winter. They'll get more out of this than thou will out of the silk gowns. There now. And he pushed the rubber tip of the bottle into the nut, and the lamb began to suck it with a ravenous ecstasy. After that there was nothing to say. By the time the lamb fell asleep, questions poured forth, and Dickon answered them all. Told them how he had found the lamb just as the sun was rising 3 mornings ago. He had been more listening to a skylark and watching him swing higher and higher into the sky. He was only a speck in the heights of blue. I'd almost lost him but for this song, and how a chap could hear it when it seemed as if he'd get out of the world in a minute. Something else far off among the gorse bushes. It was a weak bleatin', and I knowed Lammas was hungry, and I knowed it wouldn't be hungry if it hadn't lost its mother somehow. I set off searching. I did have to look for it. I went in and out amongst the gorse bushes, round and round, and I always seemed to take the wrong turnin'. But at last I seed a bit of rock on top of the moor, and I climbed up and found the little un half dead wi' comin'. While he talked, Soot flew solemnly in and out of the open window, marks about the scenery, while Nut and Shell made excursions into the big trees outside, down trunks and explored branches. Captain curled up near Dickon, who sat on the rug from preference. They looked at the pictures in the gardening books, and Dickon knew all the country names, and knew exactly which ones were already growing in the secret garden. I couldn't say that their name, he said, pointing to one under which was written Aquilegia, but us calls that a columbine. They're one that's snapdragon, and they both grow wild in hedges. This garden's one, and they're bigger and grander. There's some big clumps of garden. They'll look like a bit of blue and white butterflies fluttering when they come out. I'm going to see them, cried Colin. I am going to see them. I that the mun, quite seriously, and the munnot lose no time about it. Oh, that almost went down the wrong pipe. I put up the wrong thing. I'm actually drinking rose tea in honor of the curtains and fountains which will appear soon. Chapter 20. I Shall Live Forever. But they were obliged to wait more than a week, because first there came some very and then Colin was threatened with a cold, which two things happened one after the other, would no doubt have rage, but there was so much careful and mysterious planning to do, and only Dickon came in, if only for a few minutes, to talk about what was happening on the moor and in the villages and on the borders of streams. The things he had to tell about otters and badgers and houses, not to mention birds' nests and field mice and their burrows, were enough to make you all with excitement when you heard all the intimate details from an animal charmer, and realized what thrilling eagerness and anxiety the whole busy underworld was working. Same as us, said Dickon, only they have to build their homes every year, and it keeps them so busy they get them done. The most absorbing thing, however, was the preparations to be made before Colin could bid sufficient secrecy to the garden. No one must see the carriage with Dickon and Mary after they turned a certain corner of the shrubbery and entered upon the ivied walls. As each day passed, Colin had become more and more fixed in him that the mystery surrounding the garden was one of its greatest charms. Nothing must spoil. No one must ever suspect that they had a secret. People must think that he was simply going out because he liked them and did not object to their looking at him. They had long and quite delightful talks about their route. They would go up this path and down across the other and go round among the fountains that one, uh, oh goodness, and go round among the fountain flower beds as if they were bedding out plants. The head gardener, Mr. Roach, had been having a rain. It seemed such a rational thing to do that no one would think it at all mysterious. They would shrubbery walks and lose themselves until they came to the long walls. It was almost as elaborately thought out as the plans of march made by great generals in times of war. Rumors of the new and curious things which were occurring in the invalid's apartments filtered through the servants' halls into the stable yards and out among. But notwithstanding this, Mr. Roach was startled one day when he received orders from Master Colin's room to the effect that himself in the apartment no outsider had ever seen, as the invalid himself displayed him. Well, well, he said to himself, and as hurriedly changed his coat. What to do now's Royal Highness? That wasn't to be looked calling up a man he's never set eyes on. Mr. Roach was not without curiosity. He caught even a glimpse of the boy, and had heard a dozen exaggerated stories about his uncanniness and his insane tempers. The things he had heard oftenest was to die at any moment, and that there had been numerous fanciful descriptions of a and lifeless limbs given by people who had never seen him. Things are changing, Roach, said Mrs. Medlock, as she led him up the back staircase to the corridor, onto which opened the mysterious chamber. Let's hope they're changing for the better, Mrs. Medlock, he answered. They'll change for the worse, she continued, and queer as it is, all as it hurts them find their duty made a lot easier to stand up under. Don't you be if you find yourself in the middle of a menagerie and Mary Sotheby's Dickon more at home than me could ever be. There really was a sort of magic about Dickon, as Mary all believed, When Mr. Roach heard his name, he smiled quite leniently. "I'm in Buckingham Palace, or at the bottom of a coal mine," he said, "and yet it's not impudence either. Fine is that lad." It was perhaps well he had been prepared, or he might have been. When the bedroom door was opened, a large crow, which seemed quite as on the high back of a carven chair, announced the entrance of a caw, caw, quite loudly. In spite of Mrs. Medlock's warning, Mr. Roach escaped being sufficiently undignified to jump backward. The young man was neither in bed nor on his sofa. He was sitting in an armchair, and a young lamb was standing, shaking its tail in feeding lamb fashion, as Dickon knelt giving it milk with his bottle. A squirrel was perched on Dickon's bent back, alternatively nibbling a nut. The little girl was sitting on a big footstool looking on. "Here's Mr. Roach, calling," said Mrs. Medlock. The young Rajah turned and looked his servant. At least that was what the head gardener, felt happened. "Roach, are you?" he said. "I sent for you to give you some very important orders," answered Roach, wondering if he was to receive instructions to fell all the oaks in the park, transform the orchards into water gardens. "I am going out in my chair this afternoon," said Colin. "If the fresh air agrees with me, I may go out every day. When I go, none of the gardeners are to be near the long walk by the garden walls. No one is to be there. I shall go out about 2 o'clock, and must keep away until I send word that they go back to their work." "Very good, sir," said Roach, much relieved to hear that the oaks might remain, and that the orchards were safe. "Mary," said Colin, turning to her, "what is that thing you say in India when you have finished talking to go? You say—" "You have my permission to go," answered Mary. "The Rajah, you have my permission to go, Roach," he said. "But remember, this is very important." "Caw!" remarked the crow hoarsely, but not impolitely. "Very thank you, sir," said Mr. Roach, and Mrs. Medlock took him out of the room. Outside in the court, rather good-natured man, he smiled until he almost laughed. "My word," he said, "got a fine lordly way with him, hasn't he? You'd think he was a whole royal family rolled into one, consort and all." Protested Mrs. Medlock, "we've had to let him trample all over us ever since he had feet, and he think that's what folks was born for." "Perhaps out of it, if he lives," suggested Mr. Roach. "Well, there's one thing pretty sure," said Mrs. Medlock. "If he does live, and that India child stays here, I'll warrant she teaches him that the whole orange doesn't him, as Susan Sowerby says, and he'll be likely to find out the size of his own quarter." Inside the room, Colin was leaning back in his cushions. "It's all safe now," he said, "and this afternoon I shall be in it." Dickon went back to the garden with his creature. Mary stayed with Colin. She did not think he looked tired, but he was very quiet before his lunch. He was quiet while they were eating it. She wondered why and asked him about it. "You've got, Colin," she said. "When you are thinking they get as big as saucers. What do you think?" "I can't help thinking about what it will look like," he answered. "The garden?" asked Mary. "Springtime," he said. "I was thinking that I've never really seen it before. I scarcely ever did go. I never looked at it. I didn't even think about it." "I never saw it in it, wasn't any," said Mary. Shut in and morbid as his life, Colin had more imagination than she had, and at least he had spent a good deal of time at wonderful books and pictures. That morning when you ran in and said, it's come," quite queer. It sounds as if things were coming with a great procession and big bursts of music. I've a picture like it in one of my books. Crowds of lovely people and children and branches with blossoms on them. Everyone's laughing and dancing and crowds playing on pipes. Why, I said, perhaps we shall hear golden trumpets, and told you to throw open the window. "Funny," said Mary. "That's really just what it feels like. And if all the flowers and leaves and green wild creatures danced past at once, what a crowd it would be. I'm sure they'd sing and flute, and that would be the wafts of music." They both laughed, but it was not because laughable, but because they both so liked it. A little later the nurse made Colin ready. Instead of lying like a log while his clothes were put on, he sat up and made some efforts to help himself, and he talked and laughed with Mary all the time. "This is one of those days, sir," she said to Dr. Craven, who dropped in to inspect him. He's in such good spirits that it may. I'll call in again later this in the afternoon after he has come in, said Dr. Craven. Let's see how the going out agrees with him. I wish, he said in a very low voice, go with him. I'd rather give up the case this moment, sir, than hear while it's suggested, answered the nurse with sudden firmness. I hadn't really decided it, said the doctor with his slight nervousness. We'll try the experiment. Dickens will love a newborn child. The strongest footman in the house carried Colin down, seating him in his wheeled chair, near which Dickon waited outside. After the manservant had rugs and cushions, the Rajah waved his hand at him and to the nurse. Have my permission to go, he said, and they both disappeared quickly, and it must be confirmed when they were safely inside the house. Dickon began to push the wheeled chair slowly and steadily. Mistress Mary walked beside it, and Colin leaned back and lifted his face to the sky. It looked very high, and the small snowy clouds seemed like white birds floating on wings below its crystal blueness. The wind swept in soft, big breaths, and was strange with a wild, clear-scented sweetness. Colin kept lifting his head in, and his big eyes looked as if it were they listening instead of his ears. There are so many sighing and humming and calling out, he said. What is that scent that puffs of wind bring? It's gorse on the moors that's opening out, answered Dickon. The bees are full today. Not a human creature was to be caught sight of in the paths they took. In fact, every gardener or gardener's lad had been witched away, but they went out among the shrubbery and out and round the fountain beds, following their carefully planned route, the mere mysterious pleasure of it. But when at last they turned into the long walk by the house, the excited sense of an approaching thrill made them, for more curious they could not have explained, begin to speak in whispers. This is it, breathed Mary. This is where I used to walk up and down and wonder and wonder. Is it? Cried Colin, and began to search the ivy with eager curiousness. But I can't see nothing. Nothing, he whispered. There is no door. That's what I thought, said Mary. Then there was breathless silence, and the chair wheeled on. This is the garden where Ben Weatherstaff is it? Said Colin. A few yards more, and Mary whispered again. This thing flew over the wall, she said. Is it? Cried Colin. Oh, I wish I'd come again, said Mary with solemn delight, pointing under a big lilac bush, is where he perched a heap of earth and showed me the key. Then Colin sat up. Where? There? He cried. Were as big as the wolves in Red Riding Hood. When Red Riding Hood felt called upon to remark, Dickon stood still, and the wheeled chair stopped. And this, said Mary, stepping close to the ivy, is where I went to talk to him when he chirped at me from the top of the wall. The ivy, the wind flew back, and she took hold of the hanging green curtain. Is it? Gasped Colin. And here is the handle, and here is the door. Push him in quickly. And Dickon did it with one strong, steady, splendid push. But Colin dropped back against his cushion, even though he gasped with delight, and he had covered his eyes with his hand, shutting out everything, until they were inside, and the chair stopped as if by magic, and the door closed. Not till then did he take them away and look round and round and round, as Mary had done. And over walls and earth and trees and swinging spray-jewels, the fair green veil of tender little leaves had crept, and in the trees and the grey urns in the alcoves, and here and there everywhere were touches of gold and purple and white, and the trees were showing pink, and snow above it, and there were fluttering of wings and faint sweet pipes and husks and scents. And the sun felt warm upon his face like a hand with a love. And in wonder Mary and Dickon stood and stared at him. He looked so strange and different, blue of color that actually crept all over him, ivory face and neck and hands and all. I shall get well, he cried. I shall get well, Mary, Dickon, I shall get well, and I shall ever and ever and ever. Chapter 21. Ben Weatherstaff. One of the strange things was about living in the world is that it is only now and is quite sure one is going to live forever and ever and ever. One knows that someone gets up at the tender, solemn dawn time and goes out and stands alone and throws a whack and looks up and watches the pale sky slowly changing and flushing and marvelous unknown things happening until the east almost makes one cry out and one's heart fill in the strange, unchanging mystery of the rising of the sun, which has been for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. One knows it then for a moment or so, and sometimes when one stands by oneself in a wood at sunset, and the mysterious deep gold slanting through and under the branches seems to be saying slowly again and again something quite here, however much one tries. Then sometimes the immense quiet blue at night, millions of stars waiting and watching, makes one sure, and sound of far off music makes it true, and sometimes a look in someone's eyes. And it was like that with Colin when he first saw and heard and felt the springtime inside the walls of a hidden garden. That afternoon the whole world seemed to devote itself to being perfectly beautiful and kind to one boy. Perhaps out of pure heavenly spring came and crowded everything it possibly could into that one place, more than was in what he was doing, and stood still with a sort of growing wonder in his eyes, shaking softly. It is cradly, he said. I'm 12 going on 30, a lot of afternoons in 13 years, but seems to me like I never seed one as greatly as. Ay, it is a greatly one, said Mary, and she sighed for mere joy. I warrant it's the greatliest one as ever was in this world. Did, said Colin with dreamy carefulness, as happen it was make this year all a purpose for me? My word! cried Mary admirably. That there is a bit of good Yorkshire. Thou'rt shaping first rate, that thou art. Reigned. They drew the chair under the plum tree, which was snow white with blossom with bees. It was like a king's canopy, a fairy king's. There were cherry trees near and apple trees whose buds were pink and white, and one had burst open wide. Between the blossoming branches of the canopy bits, the blue sky looked down like wonderful eyes. Mary and Dickon worked a little here. Colin watched them. They brought him things to look at, buds which were opening, buds were closed, bits of twigs whose leaves were just showing green, the feather of a woodpecker which on the grass, the empty shell of some bird early hatched. Dickon pushed the chair slowly Varden, stepping every other moment to let him look at wonders springing out of the trailing down from trees. It was like being taken in state round the world of the magic king and queen, and shown all the mysterious riches it contained. We shall see the robin, said Colin. Thou see him often enow, a bit, answered Dickon. When the egg hatches out the little chap he'll be kept so it'll make his head swim. Thou see him flying backward and forward, carrying the worm's nest himself, and that much noise going on in the nest when he gets there, a fair fluster, scarce knows which big mouth to drop the first piece in, and gaping beaks and squawk every side. Mother says as when she sees the work of a robin has to keep them filled, she feels like she was a lady with nothing to do. She says she sees the little chins like the sweat must be dropping off 'em, though folk can't see it. This made so delightedly that they were obliged to cover their mouths with their hands, remembering that they must not be heard. Colin had been instructed to the law of whispers and low voices several days before, the mysteriousness of it, and did his best, but in the midst of excitement, excited and rather difficult, never to laugh above a whisper. Every moment of the afternoon was things, and every hour the sunshine grew more golden. The wheeled chair had been drawn back under the canopy. Dickon had sat down on the grass and had just drawn out his pipe when Colin saw something he had time to notice before. That's a very old tree over there, isn't it? He said. Dickon looked across the grass at the tree, and Mary looked, and there was a brief moment of stillness. Yes, answered Dickon after it, and his low voice had a very gentle sound. Mary thought, the branches are quite grey, and there's not a single leaf anywhere. Colin went on. Quite dead, isn't it? Aye, admitted Dickon. But them roses was climbed all over, near hide every bit of the dead wood when they're full of leaves and flowers, and then it'll be the prettiest of all." Mary still gazed at the tree and thought, "It looks as if a big branch had been broken off," said Colin. "I wonder how it was done." "It's been done many a year," answered Dickon. "Eh!" with a sudden and a relieved start, and laying his hand on Colin. "Look at that robin! There he is! He's been late." Colin was almost too late, but he had caught sight of him, the of red-breasted bird with something in his beak. He darted through the greyness and into the corner, and was out of sight. Colin leaned back on his cushion again, laughing a little. He's taking her tea to her. Perhaps it's 5 o'clock. I think I'd like some tea." And so they were safe. "It was magic which sent the robin," Mary secretly to Dickon afterward. "I know it was magic." For both she and afraid Colin might ask something about the tree whose branch had broken off 10 years ago, and they were together, and Dickon had stood and rubbed his head in a troubled way. "We mun look at it as if it wasn't no different from the other trees," he had said. "We couldn't learn how it broke, poor lad. If he says something about it, we mun cheerful." "Ay, that we mun," had answered Mary. But she had not looked cheerful when she gazed at the tree. She wondered and wondered in those few moments if there were reality in that other thing Dickon had said. He had gone on rubbing his rust-colored rust in a puzzled way, but a nice comforted look had begun to grow in his blue eyes. "Mrs. Crow is a very lovely young lady," he said, gone in rather hesitatingly. "And mother she thinks maybe she is about Misselthwaite many a time after Master Colin, same as all mothers do when they took out they have to come back, thou sees. Happen she's been in the happen it was set up to work and told us to bring them here." Mary had thought he meant something about magic. She was a great believer in magic. She quite believed that Dickon worked magic, of course good magic, on everything near him, and that was why people liked him so much, and wild creatures knew he was their friend. She wondered if it were possible that his gift had brought the robin just at the right moment when he had asked that dangerous question. She felt that his magic was working all noon and making Colin look like an entirely different boy. It did not seem possible to be the crazy creature who had screamed and beaten and bitten his pillow. Even his eyes seemed to change. The faint glow of color which had shone on his face and neck and hands got inside the garden really never quite died away. He looked as if he were made instead of ivory or wax. They saw the robin carry food to his mate, 2 or 3, and it was so suggestive of afternoon tea that Colin felt they must have some. "And make one of the men servants bring some in a basket to the rhododendron walk," he said. "Ah, and then you and Dickon can bring it here." It was an agreeable idea, easily, and when the white cloth was spread upon the grass, with hot tea and buttered toast and crumpets, a hungry meal was eaten, and several birds on domestic errands paused to inquire what was going on, and Ware led into investigating crumbs with great activity. Nut and Shell whisked up trees with pieces of cake, and Soot took the entire half crumpet into a corner and pecked at it, and examined and turned it over and made marks about it, until it decided to swallow it all joyfully in one gulp. June was dragging towards its mellow hour. The sun was deepening the gold of its lamps. Bees were going home, and the birds were flying past less often. Dickon and Mary were sitting. The tea basket was repacked, ready to be taken back to the house, and Colin left his cushions with his heavy locks pushed back from his forehead, and his face looking full color. "I don't want this afternoon to go," he said, "but I shall come the day after, and the day after, and the day after." "You'll get plenty of fresh air, won't you?" said Mary. "I'm going to get nothing else," he answered. I've seen the spring now, and I'm going to see the summer. I'm going to see everything grow here. I'm going to grow here myself." "That thou will. Us'll have thee walking about here and digging same as other folk afore long." And flushed tremendously. "Walk," he said. "Dig! Shall I?" at him was delicately cautious. Neither he nor Mary had ever asked if anything was the matter with him. "For sure thou wilt," he said stoutly. "Thou's got legs o' thine as other folks." Mary was rather frightened until she heard Colin answer. "Nothing really ails them," he said, "but they are so thin and weak. They shake so that I'm afraid to get on them." Both Mary and Dickon drew a relieved breath. "When thou'st died, thou'lt stand on 'em," Dickon said with renewed cheer. "Stop being afraid in a bit." "I shall," said Colin, and he lay still as if he thought about things. They were really very quiet for a little while. The sun was dropping. It was that hour when everything stills itself, and they really had had a busy and exciting afternoon. Colin looked as if he were resting luxuriously. Even the creatures had ceased moving about together and were resting near them. Soot had perched on a low branch and drawn up one gray film drowsily over his eyes. Mary privately thought he looked as if he might mean it. In the midst of its stillness, it was rather startling when Colin half-heard and exclaimed in a loud, suddenly alarmed whisper, "Who's that man?" Mary scrambled to their feet. "Man!" they both cried in low, quick voices, and pointed to the high wall. "Look!" he whispered excitedly. "Just look!" Mary and Dickon looked. There was Ben Weatherstaff's indignant face glaring at them over the wall from the top of the ladder. He actually shook his fist at Mary. "If I wasn't a batchelder, thou was a wench o' mine," he cried, "I'd give thee a hidin'." He stepped threateningly, as if it were his energetic intention to sit down and deal with her. But as she came toward him, he evidently thought better of it, and stood on the top of his ladder, shaking his fist down at her. "I never thought much of thee," he harangued. "By thee the first time I set eyes on thee, scrawny buttermilk-faced young always asking questions and poking thy nose in where it wasn't. I never knowed how tha got so thick wi' me, if I hadn't a been for that robin came." "Ben Weatherstaff!" called out Mary, finding her breath. Shaman called up to him with a sort of gasp. "Ben Weatherstaff! It was the robin who showed me the way." Then it did seem as if Ben really would scramble down on her side of the wall. He was so out. "The young baden!" he called down at her. "Lying there badness on a robin that was impudent enow for anything. Him showing the way. Him! Ha! The young nowt!" She could see his next words because he was so overpowered by curiosity. "However in the world did thou get in?" "It was the way," she protested obstinately. "He didn't know he was doing it, but he did. I can't tell you from here where while you're shaking your fist at me." His fist very suddenly, at that very moment, and his jaw actually dropped as he stared at something he saw coming over the grass toward him. At the first sound of his words, Colin had been so surprised that he had only sat up and listened as if it were sound. But in the midst of it he had recovered himself and beckoned imperiously to Dickon. "Wheel me over there," he commanded. "Wheel me quite close and stop right in front of him." And this, if you please, is what Ben Weatherstaff beheld, and which made his jaw drop. A wheeled chair with cushions and robes which came toward him, looking rather like some sort of stagecoach, because a young Rajah leaned back in it with a royal command, great black-rimmed eyes, and a thin white hand extended haughtily, and it stopped right under Ben Weatherstaff's nose. It was really no wonder his mouth drawed open. "Do you know who I am?" demanded the Rajah. How Ben Weather stared. His red old eyes fixed themselves on what was before him, as if he were seeing a ghost. He gazed and gulped a lump down his throat, and did not say a word. "Do you am?" demanded Colin still more imperiously. "Answer!" Ben Weather gnarled hand up and passed it over his eyes and over his forehead, and then he did answer in a clear, shaky voice. "Who thou art," he said. "I, with thy mother's eyes staring at me out of the face. Lord knows I'm here, but thou'rt the poor cripple." Colin forgot he ever had a back. His face flushed scarlet, and he sat bolt upright. he cried out furiously. I'm not! He's not, cried Mary, almost shouting up fierce indignation. He has not got a lump as big as a pin. I looked and there was no one. Then Weatherstaff passed his hand over his forehead again, and gazed as if he gazed enough. His hand shook, and his mouth shook, and his voice shook. He was an ignorant, tactless old man, and he could only remember the things he had heard. The crooked back? He said hoarsely. No, shouted Colin. That hasn't got, quavered Ben more hoarsely yet. It was too much, which Colin usually threw into his tantrums, rushed through him now in a new way. Never yet had he been accused of crooked legs, even in whispers, and the perfectly simple belief in that existence, which had really revealed to Ben Weatherstaff's voice, when Rajah flesh and blood could endure. His anger and insulted pride made him forgetting but this one moment, and filled him with a power he had never known before, a natural strength. Come here, he shouted to Dickon, and he actually began to tear the cub's lower limbs and disentangle himself. Come here, this minute! Dickon died in a second. Mary caught her breath in a short gasp and felt herself turn pale. He can do it! He can do it! He can! She gabbled over to herself under her breath as fast as ever she could. There was a brief, fierce scramble, and the rugs were tossed on the ground. Dickon held. The thin legs were out. The thin feet were on the grass. Colin was standing upright, as straight as an arrow and looking strangely tall, his head thrown back in a strange flashing lightning. Look at me, he flung up at Ben Weatherstaff. Just look at you! Just look at me! He's as straight as I am, said Dickon. He's as straight as any lad in your... What Ben Weatherstaff did, Mary thought queer beyond measure. He choked, and suddenly tears ran down his weathered, crinkled cheeks as he struck them together. He burst forth. The lies folk tells is lathe and as white as a wraith, but there's not a knob on thee. Thou'lt make a mutt, God bless thee. Dickon held Colin's arm strongly, but the boy had not turned. He stood straighter and looked Ben Weatherstaff in the face. I'm your man when my father is away, and you are to obey me. This is my garden. Don't dare about it. You get down from that ladder and go out to the long walk, and Miss Mary will meet you. I want to talk to you. We did not want you, but now you will have to be in the secret. Ben Weatherstaff's crabbed old face was still wet with that one queer rush of... It seemed as if he could not take his eyes from the thin, straight Colin standing on his feet, head thrown back. Lad, he almost whispered. My lad! Then, remembering himself, he suddenly touched his hat gardener fashion, and said, Sir, yes, sir, and obediently disappeared as he descended the ladder. Chapter 22. When the Sun Went Down. Take a quick drink. When his head was out of sight, Colin turned to Mary. Go and meet him, he said, and Mary crossed the grass to the door under the ivy. Dickon was watching him with sharp eyes. There were spots on his cheek, and he looked amazing, but he showed no signs of falling. And he said, and his head was still held up, and he said it quite grandly. I told thee that I could have stopped being afraid, answered Dickon, and that stopped. Yes, I've stopped, said Colin. Then suddenly he remembered something Mary had said. Are you making magic? He asked sharply. Dickon's curly mouth spread in a cheerful grin. Thou's doing magic thyself, he said. Magic has made these 'ere work out of the earth. And he touched with his thick clump of crocuses in the grass. Colin looked down at them. Aye, he said. Their could self up straighter than ever. I'm going to walk to that tree, he said, pointing one a few feet away from him. I'm going to be standing when Ben Weatherstaff comes. I can rest against the tree if I like. When I want to sit down, I will sit down. But bring a rug from the chair. He walked to the tree, and though Dickon held his arm, it was steady. When he stood against the tree trunk, it was not too plain that he supposed it, and he still held himself so straight that he looked tall. Weatherstaff came through the door in the wall. He saw him standing there, and he heard Mary muttering something under. "What art saying?" he asked rather testily, because he his attention distracted from the long, thin, straight boy figure, and proud. But she did not tell him. What she was saying was this: "You can do it, you can do it, you can do it, you can do it, you can." She was saying it to Colin because she could make magic and keep him on his feet looking like that. She could not bear that she should give in before Ben Weatherstaff. He did not give in. She was uplifted, feeling that he looked quite beautiful in spite of his thinness. He fixed his eyes on Ben Weather his funny, imperious way. "Look at me," he commanded. "Look at me all over. Have I got crooked legs?" Ben Weatherstaff had not quite got over his emotion, but he had recovered a little, and his answer almost in his and answered in his usual way. "Not that," he said. "Not of the sort. Doing with thyself, hiding out of sight and letting folk think thou was crippled and half-witted." "I did," said Colin angrily. "Who thought that?" "Lots of fools," said Ben. "The jackasses brayin, and they never bray naught but lies. What did thou shut thyself up for?" "Everyone thought I was going to die," said Colin shortly. "I'm not." And he said it with such. And Weatherstaff looked him over, up and down and up. "Tha die?" he said with irritation. "Not of the sort. Tha's gotten too much pluck in thee. When thou's put thy legs on the ground in such a hurry, I knowed thou was all right. Sit thee down in the rug a bit, young mester, and give me thy orders." There was a queer mixture of crabbed tenderness and shrewd understanding in his manner. Mary speech as rapidly as she could as they had come down the long walk. The chief remembered, she had told him, was that Colin was getting well, getting well. Yet no one must let him remember about having humps and dying. The Rajah condescended to seat himself on a rug under the tree. "What work do you do in the garden, Weatherstaff?" he inquired. "Anything I'm told to do, and I'm kept on by favour, 'cause she liked me." "She?" said Colin. "My mother," answered Ben Weatherstaff. "My mother?" said Colin, and he looked about him quite. This was her garden, wasn't it? "Aye, that it was," said Ben Weatherstaff, as he looked about him too. "She was main fond of it. It is my garden now. I shall come here every day," announced Colin, "but it is to be a secret. My orders no one is to know that we have come here. Dickon and my cousin have worked and made it come on. I shall send for you sometimes to help, but you must come when no one can see you." Weatherstaff's face twisted itself in a dry old smile. "I've come here before one night," he said. "What?" exclaimed Colin. "When?" "The last time I was rubbing his cheek and looking round was about 2 year ago." "But in it for 10 years," cried Colin. "There was no door." "I'm no one," then dryly, "and I didn't come through the door. I come over the wall. Old the Ruth held me back the last 2 year." "That come and did a bit of pruning," cried Dickon. "I couldn't make out who it had been done." "She was fond of," said Ben Weatherstaff slowly, "and she was such a pretty young thing. She says to me once, 'Ben,' she says, 'if ever I am ill, or if ever I go away, you must take care of my roses.' And Jay, the orders was no one was never to come nigh. But I come, obstinate, over the while I come, until the rheumatic stopped me, and I did it once a year. She gave her orders first." "It wouldn't have been as wick as it is if thou hadn't done it," said Dickon. "I did wonder." "I'm glad you did, said Colin. "You'll know how to keep the secret." "I'll know, sir," answered Ben. "It'll be easier for a man with rheumatics to come in at the door." Near the tree, Mary had dropped her trowel. Colin stretched out his hand and took it up. An awe came into his face, and he began to scratch at the earth. His thin hand was weak enough, but presently watched him, Mary, with quite breathless interest. He drove the end of the trowel into the soil and over. "You can do it, you can do it," said Mary to herself. "I tell you, you can." Dickon's round eyes were full of eager curiousness. but he said not a word. Weatherstaff looked on with interested face. Colin persevered. After he had turned a few mouthfuls of soil, he spoke exultantly to Dickon in his best Yorkshire. Said that'd have me walking about here same as other folk, and that said that'd have me digging. I thought thou was just leading to please. This is only the first day, and and here I am digging. Ben Weatherstaff's mouth fell open again when he heard him end up by chuckling. He said, that sounds as if thou got wits enough. Thou'rt a Yorkshire lad for sure, and thou'rt digging too. I'd like to something. I can get thee a rose in a pot. Go and get it, said Colin, digging quick. It was done quickly enough indeed. Ben Weatherstaff went to getting rheumatics. Dickon took his spade and dug the hole deeper and wider than with the thin white hands could make it. Mary slipped out to run and bring a can. When Dickon had deepened the hole, Colin went on turning the soft earth over and over, looked up at the sky, flushed and flowing with a strangely new exercise. I want to do it before the sun goes quite down, he said. Perhaps the sun held back a few minutes just on purpose. Ben Weatherstaff brought the rose in at the greenhouse. He hobbled over the grass as fast as he could. He had begun to get excited. He knelt down by the hole and broke the pot from the mold. Here, lad, he said, handing the gun. Set it in the earth thyself, same as the king does when he goes to a new place. The thin white hands shook a little, and Colin's flush grew deeper as he set the rose in the mold and held it while old Ben made firm the earth. It was filled and pressed down and made. Mary was leaning forward on her hands and knees. Soot had flown down and marched forward to see what was being done. Nut and shell chattered about it from the cherry tree. It's planted, said Colin at last, and the sun is only slipping over the edge. Help me up, Dickon. Be standing when it goes. That's part of the magic. And Dickon held him. Magic, or whatever it was, so gave him strength that when the sun did flip over the edge and end lovely afternoon, from them there he actually on 2 feet, laughing. I'm going to go ahead and stop. We've got about 60 pages left, and we can leave that for Wednesday, depending on when I get my computer in. Because games have been so choppy, and I'd left, the videos that I put up on YouTube, I'd like that smooth. Probably about after a year, I'm going to redo these 3 books that I Garden, Wind in the Willows, and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Until then, I'll have the choppy streams up on the YouTube. Anyways, it's amazing the stream didn't drop once. So, I'm going to go ahead and end it there, and I'll see you next week.